Good morning. Welcome to today's discussion for both those of you here in the room and those of you who are joining us online. I'm Robin Quinville, and I direct the Global Europe program here at the Wilson Center. And today's discussion represents the best of the Wilson Center in that it draws on expertise from across our regions that we cover. And I want to give a couple of special shout outs first to Isabella Tabarovsky, who is one of our leaders in this field, and another to our State Department fellow, Tim Eidelnant, my former colleague from Mission Germany. Without them, this event would not be taking place, so thank you. It's now my pleasure to introduce the Wilson Center's president and CEO, Ambassador Mark Green. Ambassador Green brings unique expertise to this center. His work as administrator for the U.S. Agency for International Development gives him that on-the-ground experience of the global challenges that we face. Ambassador Green's work as president of the International Republican Institute and CEO of the Initiative for Global Development, as well as senior director of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, gives us insight into how we might meet many of those challenges. And as ambassador to Tanzania from mid-2007 to 2009, Ambassador Green knows firsthand how policy translates into progress on the ground. He would, however, be very grouchy with me if I failed to note that he was a four-term member of the U.S. House of Representatives representing Wisconsin's 8th District, and that is in itself an illustration of the idea behind the Wilson Center, a think tank created by Congress in order to have a nonpartisan policy forum for tackling tough issues. Ambassador Green, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Robin, for those kind words. Good morning, Happy New Year, and welcome to the Wilson Center. So the Wilson Center is a unique institution in American foreign policy. As Robin alluded to, we are congressionally chartered, we're scholarship-driven, and we're fiercely nonpartisan and independent. And I always say that that special status brings with it special obligations to prioritize the most important issues and opportunities, and to try to do so in ways that adds value and hopefully makes a difference. Now, it is an honor to have all of you here in person and virtually for what promises to be a critical and timely discussion on combating anti-Semitism, a topic that demands our constant vigilance and our collective action. Sadly, anti-Semitism is not a relic of history. It's a modern-day threat. From violent attacks on Jewish communities to the rise of hateful rhetoric online, we're witnessing troubling trends worldwide, disastrous trends worldwide. Anti-Semitism spread presents a challenge to democracies, undermining the very fabric of our societies. It is our responsibility as policymakers, scholars, community leaders, and global citizens to confront these challenges head on. So today's event must not be an endpoint, but merely the beginning of a broader conversation. Throughout 2025, as the world marks the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, we'll be bringing together a variety of voices engaged in fighting the scourge of anti-Semitism and the threat that it poses to democratic societies. Each of these events will build on the foundation we set here today, ensuring that combating anti-Semitism, extremism, hate in any form remains central to our work here at the Wilson Center. For today's discussion, we have a distinguished lineup of speakers from around the globe, each a renowned leader and expert in the fight against anti-Semitism. I'd now like to welcome Aaron Kayak, Deputy Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism with the Department of State. He is an experienced leader and an interfaith coalition builder who's held senior roles advising members of Congress and the administration. I know his insights will challenge us to think critically and to act decisively. Thank you for joining us in this important discussion. Let's all use today as an opportunity to reflect, to learn, and to recommit ourselves to combating anti-Semitism and really all forms of hate. Deputy Special Envoy, the floor is yours.
Check them up there.
Either way.
Thanks, Ambassador. Well, first, there's plenty of Washington experience in this room, but one of the unique and esteemed responsibilities of a deputy, and only those of you who have been deputies, is to be eminently disappointing when filling in for the principal. So first, I just want to say that Ambassador Lipstadt regrets that she's not able to join us today because of some unforeseen circumstances over the weekend. Since this is probably one of the last times our office is going to be giving public remarks, I just want to spend a minute on the greatness of Ambassador Lipstadt. There are plenty of professors throughout the country, but not as many professors here in Washington. There are lots of ambassadors and former ambassadors here in Washington, not so many throughout the country. But what we've seen with Ambassador Lipstadt is a unique blend, both of decades of scholarship and expertise, but also diplomatic deftness, which is not always a guarantee. I remember about 2.5 years ago seeing her give her inaugural address at the Holocaust Museum, and it was a remarkable feat, but she knows how to give good speeches. What wasn't sure is how great her contributions would be in fighting anti-Semitism on behalf of the United States, and as such a remarkable diplomat. We have some members of our team here. We couldn't do it without them. So first, I just want to say we've been lucky to have her as a public servant. And of course, thank you to the Wilson Center for this important event. Special thanks to Timothy, Ambassador Green, Robin, Marissa, for championing this important issue. It wasn't that long ago when you wouldn't have the opportunity for an event, especially at such a serious center on anti-Semitism. Both now we have the need and the understanding from such important organizations that it is in fact a foreign policy issue to combat this hate. I also want to recognize our counterparts in this fight, Fernando Lautenberg, Jillian Siegel, Dr. Felix Klein, Alexandra Gussel, Matthias Dreyfus, and Rabbi Andy Baker. One of the other things about our office, when it was created 20 years ago, or 21 years ago, we were the first Office of the Special Envoy. What's happened since then is that we've been joined by dozens of other counterparts, envoys, coordinators, special representatives, and we've built out this international network of government officials dedicated to the fight against anti-Semitism. In my final week as Deputy Special Envoy, and after 3 years, I wanted to give an overview of what we've done and maybe provide some nuggets, kernels for discussion today. Our team has risen to the occasion, traveling throughout the world. We've launched global guidelines to combat anti-Semitism, a U.S. national strategy, a symposium to counter online hate. And one thing that's been consistent pre-October 7th, but also since October 7th, is that too many people make excuses or reasons for anti-Semitism. If you stopped what was happening in the Middle East, maybe I would treat my local Jewish community better. The connection of Jews everywhere to the actions of one particular government. So I wanted to spend a few moments to talk about how we've grown to see anti-Semitism as a multi-layered threat. First and foremost, of course, it's the impact on the local Jewish community. If anti-Semitism were solely a threat to Jews, it would be the responsibility of governments and all of us to protect a vulnerable religious or ethnic minority. That alone is reason enough. In addition to that, though, I think what we've learned to understand over the past 3 years is that it's a fundamental threat to democracy. If you truly believe in the anti-Semitic conspiracy myth, you believe that Jews are behind the banks, behind the financial systems, behind the politicians, behind your government, you seek to be able to hold your government accountable. You don't believe your bank when you don't have the money in your account because there's this nefarious force behind these systems. And one of the unique aspects of anti-Semitism is that it's a horseshoe. As you get more and more extreme on the right and the left, the anti-Semites come to believe very similar things about Jews and about the world, even though they disagree on everything else. But as you go further in the horseshoe, you find that the anti-Semitic conspiracy myths find plenty of people who agree. And the other part about that is, if you are a partisan on the left or the right, you're very good at calling out anti-Semitism on the other side with 20/20 vision. I have friends on the right who can call out anti-Semitism on the left perfectly, and I have friends on the left who never fail at an opportunity to call out anti-Semitism on the right. But the problem with that is, when you don't call out anti-Semitism, regardless of political ideology, is that you're weaponizing the charge of anti-Semitism. Why would you only call it out if it's with people with whom you disagree on every other issue? So what's important for our office, and besides Deborah and I, it'll be continuing its work with career diplomats, which I know is something the Wilson Center cares deeply about. If you don't call out anti-Semitism on the other side of the political spectrum, what does that say about why you're calling out that anti-Semitism? And we all know that anti-Semitism has existed for thousands of years. That's why it's so comfortable for anti-Semites to spread their rhetoric. Just as an example, of course, my colleagues here and I go to work at the State Department, and we have to go through protesters on the way to work. And that's not enjoyable. But we are the ones who are making the policy that they disagree with. I have friends at the White House who have to go through different entrances because protesters are blocking their entrance. But that is a legitimate form of protest. I also go to synagogue in downtown Washington, D.C. And when there are protesters heckling my 7-year-old daughter just for wanting to pray Saturday morning, that's a choice. When there are car attacks against my synagogue and it has to become a mini fortress because it sits at the corner of an intersection, that's a choice. Why are those protesters doing that? When on the eve of Kristallnacht, the kosher restaurant on my block has huge bricks thrown through its window, or thrown at its windows, that's a choice. And why do the anti-Semites feel so comfortable doing that? If you took it out of the realm of anti-Semitism, if you took it out of the realm of the Middle East politics at all, for example, I'm sure many of us disagree with how the PRC treats its Uyghur population, but it would simply be inconceivable for any of us to go protest in front of a Chinese restaurant. It just wouldn't register. But yet, the grooves of anti-Semitism are so well worn in society that these political activists, often some of them anti-Semites, just fall right into it. There's another layer. It's a layer to national security and international stability. Malign actors recognize the potency of anti-Semitism, something that we've been calling more of a utilitarian anti-Semitism. So, for example, when Putin began his war of aggression against Ukraine, he used the unbelievable, absurd attack that he was doing it to denazify Ukraine, a country led by a Jewish president. But yet, it was so believable to too many people throughout the world. And as the United States moves forward in our global competition with folks like Russia and others, in our global competition, especially in the global south, you'll see that our malign actors and some governments will use anti-Semitic rhetoric to lay in question the Western form of government. Because, of course, we can talk about how great democracy is, but if democracy is not working, or if the citizens can't hold their government accountable through democratic means, for whatever reason, maybe it's simply not working. But if you can believe in the anti-Semitic conspiracy myth, like I said earlier, even more so, our global competitors can hold up their form of government as something that's more stable, less able to be controlled by these nefarious actors. And of course, it's being used by both state and non-state actors to sow this unrest. Now, what do we do to counter the threat? So first and foremost, when I came into office and when Ambassador Lipstadt was confirmed by the Senate about 2.5 years ago, first and foremost, it's very simple. We just want governments and people and society to take anti-Semitism seriously and to just recognize the value of of Jewish humanity. All Jews need to be treated as equals and as any other citizen would be treated. There need not be special treatment. Just simply, we don't talk about this at the State Department that much, but they're God-given. In the Jewish tradition, everyone is made in the image of God. And if we could just realize that sanctity or that value, that would be enough. So we want governments and individuals to take anti-Semitism seriously. But just saying that's not enough. So our office, along with our colleagues, some of them on the line and over here, launched the first ever global guidelines to counter anti-Semitism. It's a milestone diplomatic achievement, first ever international framework to counter anti-Semitism. It's embraced by both countries with large Jewish populations and countries with virtually no Jews. Because, of course, first of all, with the advent of social media, the lines between domestic and international anti-Semitism are blurred. But also, just like any other human rights issue or national security issue, it's up to all governments, regardless of if they have this specific threat domestically, to counter it. We launched the global guidelines of Buenos Aires in July 2024. At the time, we had around 30 endorsements. Now we have over 40 endorsements from governments and international organizations such as the EU, and not just countries in Europe, as a lot of these sorts of efforts have been launched before, but throughout the Americas and really throughout the world, and we're confident that that list will continue to grow. In 2023, as many of you remember, President Biden launched the first ever U.S. national plan to combat anti-Semitism. Our office was in somewhat of an awkward position because we would go around the country and encourage other countries to make plans on anti-Semitism when we ourselves had not done so yet. So thank you to the President for his leadership on that. And then, of course, civil society should build bridges between communities. It's not something that government can do alone. And if you go read the plan, and I encourage you to, it's not very long, you'll see there are specific actions that our government calls for. And I think something that's important for people to understand is we're not a constituents outreach organization. There are folks in the White House who deal with different religious minorities in the United States. We are combating anti-Semitism as a national security priority and foreign policy priority for the United States. Sometimes when I go around the world and when I come back and brief the Hill or others in venues like this, they ask, how do you convince people to take anti-Semitism seriously? How do you convince governments to take anti-Semitism seriously? Of course, we try to convince them. But one of the things that's important to understand about an office like ours and a White House that prioritizes the fight against anti-Semitism is that we actually don't have to convince other governments to take anti-Semitism seriously. It'd be good if they did that. But because it is a national priority for the United States, if we have a bilateral relationship and our partner doesn't take anti-Semitism seriously, that's a problem for our bilateral relationship. Just like that we have governments throughout the world with whom we might disagree on trade policy or, for example, the war in Ukraine. And we're not going to convince them to come to our point of view, but they have to accept our point of view as our point of view and adjust accordingly. Just to briefly go through the global guidelines, of course you could all Google it. They launched in July, and they have 12 simple calls for action, as you would think, guidelines to combat anti-Semitism, calling it out, educate it, define it, and do a whole of society approach. The global guidelines arose from extensive consultations among dozens of special envoys and coordinators dedicated to countering anti-Semitism. And although the U.S. has taken a leadership role, it is not solely a U.S. initiative. It really came out of this global network of special representatives and special envoys. They're voluntary and legally non-binding. They're succinct and cogent, designed to be widely understood and broadly applicable. And they aim to strengthen the international cooperation to counter anti-Semitism in a manner that reinforces our common fight against hate and discrimination. Of course, the global guidelines could also be used by non-government agencies, non-government entities, like soccer clubs, for example. but also anyone who's trying to take the fight against anti-Semitism seriously, whether you're an executive at a corporation or you're a government leader, can use them as a way forward. It's a truly landmark achievement of our office, and they are quite a diverse group of governments and multilateral organizations. We also launched the first ever national strategy about 1.5 years ago that was inspired by the EU and some European governments, represented by my fellow speakers today. We represented a whole of society approach, including over 100 concrete actions that can be taken by governments and civil society. Collaboration is crucial. We couldn't have accomplished everything we've done without our wonderful partners, and for sure without our wonderful team members. I won't embarrass them by asking them to stand up, but they really are terrific. And what's happened throughout the history of our office over the 20 years, unfortunately, is that it's ebbed and flowed with the individuals who led it. Our predecessors have both been talented and dedicated and in this fight, but they leave office. It's come and gone based off of the strength of particular political appointees. And what we've done over the past 3 years is ensured that we had a backbone of civil servants. Actually, since Deborah's not in the room, all my colleagues here are civil servants and will remain in their jobs on January 21st. So what that means is the blocking and tackling of everyday diplomacy to combat anti-Semitism will continue. It's not because our predecessors or the previous presidents over the past 20 years didn't take the fight against anti-Semitism seriously. It's just that the office basically ceased to exist for many years. And so we're hoping that through this upcoming presidential transition and with the leadership of the incoming White House, that this staffing level will be the floor to the bandwidth of our office. And those of you, I see some of our friends from NGOs, but also in the think tank world, and for sure in cooperation with the Wilson Center, we encourage you to continue to engage with our office. Of course, Deborah and I are leaving, but that's the way our system of government works, and the American people have a say. But I think there's so much that our office does that doesn't get seen on a daily basis, that doesn't get picked up by C-SPAN, that doesn't make the headlines. Just the interacting on a daily basis with the human rights officers in our various embassies throughout the world, both educating them, but also empowering them to educate the governments with whom they deal. And understanding that Jewish communities throughout the world who feel vulnerable have a direct line to the highest levels of the US government. They can go to their embassy can give us a call, and even, whether or not there's a Senate-confirmed ambassador at the top of our office, we will ensure, or they, I should say, will ensure that that threat gets taken seriously and that the full power of the US government stands with them in the fight against anti-Semitism. Lastly, as I said earlier, it's easy for political partisans to see anti-Semitism on the other side of the political spectrum, but just like the Wilson Center itself, this must be a non-partisan issue. Of course, there are, throughout the entire spectrum of the political ideology, there are anti-Semites on the extremes of either side, but once we make this solely a partisan cause, then both it ebbs and flows with who's in the White House, but also it's undermining the actual fight against anti-Semitism. If this just became a left or right issue, then you lose responsibility, or you feel like you lose the responsibility to call it out with people with whom you agree. And when that happens, it might feel good at the moment, but it makes Jews throughout the world feel, and in fact, are less safe because of that. So I think in the, given who our host is this morning, I think as we move forward, we should remain dedicated to the nonpartisanness of the issue and the seriousness with which we take it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Aaron. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tim Eidelnant. I'm a State Department Fellow here at the Wilson Center this year. And I'm very, very honored to moderate this important discussion on how governments and how international organizations can proactively combat anti-Semitism in the coming years. We have a really incredible group of experts with us today, both in person and virtually, representing different perspectives from around the world. First, as Aaron highlighted, just to spend a second on Ambassador Lipstadt's legacy, she's been really a tireless leader in the global fight against anti-Semitism. She was planning to be with us here today, but in general, her dedication and her impact resonate far beyond her role as Special Envoy, and we wish her speedy recovery. Very briefly, allow me to introduce our panelists today. Joining us in person, Rabbi Andrew Baker, personal representative of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, chair in office for combating anti-Semitism. And joining us online today, Dr. Felix Klein, the German federal government commissioner for Jewish life in Germany and the fight against anti-Semitism. Alexander Güssel, the Council of Europe's Secretary General, Special Representative on Anti-Semitic and Anti-Muslim Hate. Matthias Dreyfus, Deputy Delegate of the French Intergovernmental Delegation Against Anti-Semitism. Fernando Lautenberg, Organization of American States Commissioner to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism. And last but not least, Gillian Seagal, Australia's Special Envoy for Combating Anti-Semitism. So perhaps to start this moderated discussion, I'll turn first to Gillian in Australia. First of all, acknowledging the very late hour in Australia and great appreciation for you joining us. Ms. Seagal, the last few days, we saw reports of additional incidents, vandalism against places of worship in Sydney, in Australia. There's been an alarming increase in anti-Semitic incidents in Australia in general last year. So the question is, how will your government work to reverse this trend and ensure the safety and inclusion of Australia's Jewish community, and other specific initiatives or partnerships that you are prioritizing? Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the Wilson Centre for hosting this and for allowing me to speak. Apologies that I may not listen to everyone, but it's 2:30 in the morning here, and unfortunately I do not have the luxury of a day off tomorrow or today, later today. Your question is a pertinent one because we are about to go into an election. The election has to be called before May, and it's most likely to be in March. And I think for the first time, and this has been pointed out by the Jewish community leaders and by the media, I think the issue of anti-Semitism will be an election issue, which is unusual in that the opposition, which is the Conservative Party, has alleged that the government has done an insufficient amount in relation to combating anti-Semitism, and will make it and has already made it a defining issue for them, and it will be an election issue. And I think it will be for the first time that the Jewish community will be voting probably not on regular policies about environment or anything else, but on which government is going to do something more about anti-Semitism. And certainly it is the opposition that has said they will be stronger, they will come out more effectively about incidents. That is not to say that the current government is not doing things. So the first thing they did was actually establish my office, and I think I have to thank Ambassador Lipstadt and Aaron for visiting Australia and actually convincing the government to do something. So I was really following advocacy from the community. Only 6 months ago, just before the gathering in Buenos Aires, that my office was established. So Australia was definitely a laggard. And I think it was basking in a vision of itself as a happy multicultural country far away from the conflicts in Europe. And it didn't need such a position. But all of a sudden, as we see these things happening slowly, but then suddenly, there was a huge uptick. We saw it immediately after October 7, about a 700% uptick in incidents. That's not even including things online, just actual incidents. And that has been maintained compared to last year at about a 350, 400% increase. So still very significant. But we have, quite right, seen a spate of very serious current incidents where a synagogue in Melbourne was torched, and the vision of it was a reminiscent of Kristallnacht, to actually see a synagogue burnt. Actually, it didn't burn, the entire synagogue didn't burn to the ground, just half the synagogue. It was a synagogue that sort of had two halves, and one synagogue burnt. But I actually went to visit and to, smell the soot in the air and to see the holy books and the other library destroyed. It was very sobering. And then we've had a copycat incident that was in Victoria, in New South Wales, where a synagogue was daubed with anti-Semitic graffiti, and an attempt was made to spread accelerant, but fortunately didn't stay alight. So what the government has done in response to, and we've had lots of other incidents of cars being vandalized, buildings being vandalized and daubed with mostly graffiti, rather than just anti-Semitic graffiti, but Nazi graffiti. The government has passed, the federal government, and we have a mishmash of legislation at a federal and state level. The government has passed a legislation banning the use of Nazi insignia, and that went through both federal level and state level. And the federal government has formed a task force together with the state governments to investigate these attacks, combining state and federal police and anti-terrorism forces. And that's what the government has been saying it's been doing in response, and condemning it, of course. What has happened, and what the government has not tackled, is the chain of finding those responsible, then prosecuting them, and then ensuring that they have a significant penalty at the end. And at the moment, I think my office has done a lot of work looking at the patchwork of laws that exists in relation to this area, which is state and federal. And most of the judiciary, magistrates and judges, where there has been a prosecution, have considered it not as a pattern of behavior, systematically intimidating the Jewish community, but as an incident, an isolated incident, probably by a first offender, and mostly just graffiti, which is property damage. And they haven't taken into account, and I'd be interested if in any other country there is any regime which can convince the judiciary side of the equation to take these seemingly unconnected incidents. I mean, the Jewish community knows they're connected, but the non-Jewish community sees a daubing of a building in one state and then a daubing of a building in another state, and they are prosecuted separately. But we see it as a systemic, harassing, intimidatory rise of anti-Semitism manifesting in different ways, and it should be punished accordingly. But our laws don't in any way provide that. One can plead aggravation and an aggravated anti-Semitic influence, but it's not necessarily, it's in the discretion of the magistrate and the judge, and it doesn't necessarily seem to resonate. And if you don't have an effective, significant penalty for that kind of behavior, even if the person is actually apprehended, it's not sending the message that that is unacceptable. So that is, I think, the problem of anti-Semitism as we are seeing it happening in Australia at the moment. My office has only been in existence for 6 months, but we've spent a significant portion of the beginning of the period dealing with universities, because we had all the encampments that universities in the US had. We had a Senate hearing on some of that in which I appeared. And as a result of that, universities in Australia have had to revamp their complaint schemes and report to the regulator and to my office on student complaints. And at my suggestion, a student ombudsman was appointed as a federal appointment to hear complaints that they were going to hear anyway about sexual assault on university campuses and now anti-Semitism. So for this new year, we start our university year shortly, the beginning of the year. We have, as I said, the Joint Task Force. There is quite a lot of work being done by the police forces. And the next focus of my work is to look at school education and to ensure that the Holocaust education that's mandatory in the history curriculum throughout Australia, and it's state-based, also carries that through into understanding of anti-Semitism. And that's a question of providing the right materials to teachers, etc. The other area I'm also going to be focused on is some engagement with business, and I'd be interested whether any other jurisdiction has successfully managed that. I suppose that's probably enough about what's going on here, but I think it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out in the election and what additional government has, and opposition, of course, have promised and given additional funding for security, and synagogues and schools and other Jewish institutions have significant security around them, but it doesn't seem to have stopped graffiti and potentially worse. Thank you.
Thank you to Gillian Siegel for these comments. If I could take two of your comments on judicial and legal challenges that you mentioned, and on Holocaust education, and turn to Dr. Klein, Dr. Felix Klein, joining us from Berlin. Having served in Germany as a US diplomat recently, we know that Germany is one of the leaders in Holocaust education and in addressing anti-Semitism. The question to you, Dr. Klein, is what new approaches or strategies will your government pursue to tackle emerging challenges and to strengthen Jewish life in Germany and beyond? And maybe you can briefly talk about sort of the recent legislation that passed through German government in terms of sort of legal and judicial challenges that Ms. Siegel mentioned. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me and for hosting this important event. It's great to see so many colleagues again. And Gillian, I'm very much looking forward to meeting you in person. I hope at some opportunity. I would like to follow up on what Aaron said, Kaya. The fight against anti-Semitism should be really not subject to party policy. It should be a bipartisan and really broad fight, and this was also the philosophy of the recent resolution our parliament, the Bundestag, passed in November last year, a resolution on combating anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish life in Germany. The resolution was passed by all 4 democratic parties in parliament. So in it, the Social Democrats, the Greens, the Liberals, and the Christian Democrat painted an accurate picture of the situation regarding anti-Semitism since October 7th and before, and demand that even more resources need to be mobilized to protect Jews in Germany against violence and abuse, and that more needs to be done to educate all people of all ages and backgrounds on how anti-Semitism not only threatens Jews, but also the foundations of our democracy. So far, so good. The problem with the resolution was not its contents, but how long it took to get all players involved to agree on it. Originally, it was actually planned for October 9th, 2023, so shortly after the 7th of October attack, and it eventually was passed an entire year later. What should have been an obvious consensus, namely stating that all forms of anti-Semitism need to be tackled and what they were and what actions need to follow, turned out to be a point of contention, actually. As you can imagine, there were reservations to call Israel-related anti-Semitism in all its forms what it is, classic Jew hatred in modern disguise. The deliberations about this and other issues took so long that pundits called the resolution dead on arrival. Civil society organizations, for instance, started a relentless and often toxic campaign against the resolution, including formerly well-respected human rights organizations like Amnesty International that are recently more famous for their obsession with Israel. So the bad news is that combating all forms of anti-Semitism seems to be no consensus in Germany, or it's difficult to reach consensus. The good news, on the other hand, was that those who opposed using the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism as the only valid definition could be convinced of including it in the resolution, and thereby all forms of anti-Semitism in the resolution, despite immense outside pressure, did not manage. So that was good, but this shows that standing our ground when it comes to combating anti-Semitism and how to do it in Germany is worthwhile. The resolution, while not legally binding, gives me and my colleagues here in Germany an excellent and strong mandate from the People's Parliament to double down on our efforts to secure Jewish life in Germany and our democratic values. Also, like in Australia, we face an election here in Germany shortly in February, and the resolution really contains very concrete suggestions how to follow up on the fight against anti-Semitism regarding our penal code. Incitement of the people and other legal provisions have to be modernized. We have to revise our provisions regarding the fight against anti-Semitism online. We would like to foster the legal situation of victims of anti-Semitic attacks when it comes to court cases in our procedural code. And of course, the big field of education needs to be revised. Here in Germany, the federal level is not competent. We don't have any jurisdiction for education, but still, of course, we will spread ideas for the Länder to foster the fight against anti-Semitism in schools. And what is very important is we also foster research, particularly Israel-related anti-Semitism is on the rise at universities here. We need to establish more Israel centers here in Germany. And what will be my issue personally is also we would like to establish a research center focusing on today's Jewish life in Germany. The knowledge of Jewish life focuses very much on past Jewish life in the 1920s and 30s, and there's no institute in Germany for the time being that focuses on the Jewish life of today, particularly when it comes to non-religious parts of Jewish life. And this is what happens to be done in the following and the upcoming parliamentary period. So it shows, of course, issues are going on, and I would like to take the opportunity, Aaron, to thank so much your office, also Deborah's fantastic efforts to gather so many colleagues. I was really impressed by the US leadership we need, and it was covered, and it was a great pleasure working with you and your office. And it's great also that you also announced, of course, also the upcoming US administration will also, of course, fight against anti-Semitism, and I'm looking forward to continuing. It's an issue that will stay with us. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Klein. Yeah, from personal experience, and I know that Dr. Liebstadt has traveled to Germany a number of times, but having served in Leipzig at our small consulate there and working with small Jewish communities in Halle, in Leipzig, and Chemnitz, that's a very important relationship for U.S. government and will continue to be so. Staying sort of on a European perspective, especially given the shared regional challenges of rising anti-Semitism in Europe, if I could turn to Mr. Dreyfus in Paris, because France has also faced persistent challenges in combating anti-Semitism. So as you look to the future, what specific steps or initiatives is French government planning to do to protect Jewish communities in France?
Thank you very much. First, let me thank the organizers to invite me and to present France's situation and on this, of course, burning issue, both on a domestic and on a global scale. Just go back to last week, because last week we commemorated in France the 10 years after the assault of the hypercacher next to Paris in 2015, and I had the sad privilege to be invited to light a candle to the memory of one of the victims. Yoav Attab was killed during this assault. And unfortunately, 10 years after the hypercacher assault, and despite the strongest efforts made by the public authorities to confront and to condemn anti-Semitic acts, we must face the fact that anti-Semitism in France is still on the rise, especially since October 7, 2023. You know probably the figures. Last year, 2023, 1,676 anti-Semitic acts, not mentioning the online hatred, were recorded by the French Ministry of Interior. And unfortunately, this year in 2024, we do not have still all the numbers, but probably that the anti-Semitic acts will be around the same trend. So maybe 1,500, 1,600 for 2024. So, of course, it has been a very crucial issue. And to follow up on what Julian Siegel said, actually, we had elections last year in France, and anti-Semitism was an election issue. Which actually was very surprising for French politics, as you might imagine. And I would also use the metaphor used by Ambassador Lipstadt on the horseshoe, because we had this issue both on the far left, in conjunction with the conflagration in the Middle East and the porosity between anti-Semitism, the one side, and anti-Zionism, and more broadly, the hatred of Israel on the other side, and also from the far right. And last week we had also, maybe you've heard that the death of the far right patriarch Jean-Marie Le Pen, who founded 50 years ago a political party based on racism and anti-Semitism and xenophobia. So we know that it is a multi-layered threat. So to answer your question, what are the next steps? What France has done since October 7, and what France plans to do in the next few weeks or months? I would say that there are many issues that France has tackled since October 7, and even before October 7. But of course, that October 7 last year put the stress on very crucial issues. I mean, first, the issue of collecting data and reporting acts, anti-Semitic acts. We've already mentioned it, but we have an issue on how to identify, how to collect, how to report anti-Semitic incidents in schools, especially in higher education system, especially. In France, we have, the education system is very centralized, but the higher education system is less centralized, and we have many informations coming from different channels, and we need to centralize it. So there was last year, even before October 7, indeed, the Minister of Higher Education launched a monitoring system in order to centralize all the reporting of anti-Semitic acts occurring in campuses. But we need also, in a way, to define more precisely what is contemporary anti-Semitism. And of course, the link with the era definition, and more broadly, the connection between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism needs to be more implemented in campuses. So this is a very important issue, and we, in the next few weeks, have worked specifically on this idea of definitions. Connected to that, one of the pillars of the national strategy is training public servants, teachers especially, but not only, prosecutors, on the various forms of anti-Semitism. And of course, and it's also what Dr. Klein said, we need probably to improve the legal arsenal in order to better take action against the massive litigation, especially online. And we know that it's not only a French discussion, but it's a European discussion, and of course connected to the implementation of the Digital Services Act in Europe. So Minister of Equality, Aurore Berger, last week announced the official launching of a national conference on the fight against anti-Semitism, which will start its works next month, so starting in February. And the idea of this national conference is to gather all the anti-racist and the NGOs working on the fight against anti-Semitism, of course, administrations on the other side, but also, to have a kind of whole of society effort. This was one of the global guidelines France endorsed last summer, but the idea is also to gather, for example, student unions, for example, business entrepreneurs, and all these actors who do not on a daily basis deal with the fight against anti-Semitism, but to raise awareness on this specific issue. And we will also, in the same period, launch a national sensibilization campaign on the issue of anti-Semitism. So we hope that these efforts from the government will help, first, better define anti-Semitism, and we know that it's a difficult path, and Germany's example is quite revealing of all the difficulties just to define what is anti-Semitism and all the forms of anti-Semitism today. But I think it's the prerequisite to have more efficient public policy on this topic.
Thank you, Mr. Dreyfus. Appreciate your remarks. Cognizant of time, and I want to make sure we hear from our last three panelists and have a time for at least a few questions. Rabbi Baker, could you help us maybe tie together the remarks of earlier panelists? You represent OSCE amongst other organizations, but you work for OSCE in terms of sort of broader multi-country strategy and perspective. Finland just assumed OSCE leadership for this year. What initiatives do you anticipate in terms of emerging from Finnish leadership and from OSCE in general in combating anti-Semitism across member states of OSCE?
Yeah, Kim, thank you. Look, there's an arc here, and I want to just share it with people because we're focused in on much of the details right now, but I think we need to see how we got here. The reality is we saw a surge of anti-Semitism over 20 years ago taking place in Europe in the early 2000s. Governments not at all prepared at the time even to recognize it, let alone to deal with it. The OSCE became, I think, really the first venue to take up the issue, one of the few governmental regional organizations where the U.S. sat around the table with all European governments. And that led to a very first conference in 2003 in Vienna focused on anti-Semitism. It was followed a year later in Berlin by a high-level conference, our Secretary of State at the time, Colin Powell, participating, many foreign ministers participating, and it also led to the declaration known as the Berlin Declaration, which spelled out some of the initial commitments that governments would be expected to take to address the problem of anti-Semitism. Notably among them were really to
identify, monitor, and react to hate crimes. The reality was most governments didn't even acknowledge such a form of attack, but a crime based on prejudice directed, in this case, at Jews or Jewish targets was something that needed to be flagged and addressed. So if we look now really over this 20-year period, on the one hand, if we look at what governments have done or what the OSCE and some international organizations have done, it's a remarkable progression of very positive developments. The position I hold was first created at the OSCE in 2005. And in reality, it was the first special envoy on anti-Semitism that existed. It was true the legislation establishing the office here in Washington was adopted in 2004, but a first U.S. special envoy didn't come into place until 2006. So it started something in motion, the reality that we can have good colleagues from around the world now gathering together is also a reflection of how the issue has been taken more seriously and comprehensively. But if we look at what the concerns were then, in many ways, they are very much the concerns we face now. So the question of identifying forms of anti-Semitism. That OSCE Berlin Declaration indicated that anti-Semitism had taken on new forms and manifestations. It spoke explicitly about the fact that incidents in the Middle East or in Israel can never justify anti-Semitism. It led to the drafting of a working definition of anti-Semitism, which, while we reference the IRA definition, people should know that its origin was in a definition put out by the European Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia literally 20 years ago this month. I, in my AJC role, had really helped to effectively negotiated that definition with the EUMC director. But that definition spoke about understanding anti-Semitism in relation to Israel, both how Israel itself could be demonized, but also how Jews themselves could be surrogate targets, if you will, for hatred directed at Israel. Later in 2016, there's a long history here, but effectively it was that definition adopted by IRA, which we know so well and which has gained more and more use and endorsement. But I think for reasons that we've seen, if anything, since October 7th, 2023, make abundantly clear today this strand, this type of anti-Semitism and its lethal at times impact on Jewish life. One of the other European-wide agencies addressing this issue has been the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights, or FRA. It conducted a very first survey of the perception and experience of Jews in Europe back in 2012, a survey that was first published in 2013. And at the time, many of us were truly alarmed by what we saw in that survey, the number of Jews who were even changing their behavior because of the experience of anti-Semitism. Upwards then of 30% of European Jews were saying they would always or at times avoid identifying themselves as Jews in public, wearing a kippah or a Magen David around their neck. We really were shocked at that number. Well, FRA did its most recent survey a year ago, and in this survey, to that same question, we now find upwards of 80% of Jews in Europe will always or sometimes hide their Jewish identity in public. So it is almost telling us to be a Jew today in Europe is simply to hide your Jewish identity when you're on the street. That, I think, is the real challenge we face. That doesn't mean we haven't solved the problems of security, which are with us and increasing. It doesn't mean that we really have done all that we can in the area of education. The OSCE has developed guidelines for governments on Jewish community security. It's developed guidelines for the development of curricula on addressing anti-Semitism, guidelines and recommendations that go beyond the issue of Holocaust education. I think we're all mindful of its importance, but we are also equally mindful of its limitations as a tool to directly fight anti-Semitism. As you noted, Finland now holds the OSCE chairmanship. It has become a tradition in the OSCE that at a time loosely connected to International Holocaust Remembrance Day, the chair in office will organize a conference addressing anti-Semitism. In fact, the foreign minister of Finland, our current chair, will host this conference in Helsinki in February. Some of us, literally 2 weeks from today, will be in Europe, will be at Auschwitz, where we will mark the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. Today, there are perhaps no more than 1,000 survivors from the Auschwitz concentration camp. So I think we're very mindful that in the shadow of remembering what took place 80 years ago, the fight against anti-Semitism, if anything, is more current, more challenging than we've seen in decades.
Thank you, Rabbi Baker. Council of Europe is another organization which is like OSCE, instrumental in trying to unite its member states against hate. Mr. Güssel, looking ahead at 2025, what proactive measures or partnerships will the Council prioritize to address anti-Semitism and hate?
Hello to everybody. First of all, thank you very much for the Wilson Center for organizing this discussion. I should say that hearing to colleagues, now speaking for the OSCE, talking about the European Union, the Fundamental Rights Agency, coming from the Council of Europe, I should unfortunately say that we are so many European organizations and we all have things to do. So we do not risk to be unemployed when it comes to fighting anti-Semitism. This phenomenon is on the rise, and in the Council of Europe, we feel that this European problem is still really unresolved. You know, the Council of Europe was founded more than 75 years ago with this motto, never again, as the state of Israel. And still today in Europe, we face anti-Semitism and we feel that the never again is very important of actuality and needs to be really our very important motto. Now, first of all, let me share my gratitude and appreciation of the role Ambassador Liebstedt has played over the years. She has been and remains a truly global figure in raising awareness, creating policy recommendations, and gaining the respect of everyone in this field and beyond. I am very proud that one of her very recent visits has been to Strasbourg, to the Council of Europe. It was absolutely important for us. It was very much appreciated. And I'm confident that she will continue to contribute to the fight against anti-Semitism. Now, coming to the Council of Europe, which is a standard-setter organization, I should say that we have a number of instruments. Of course, the European Convention on Human Rights, the recommendations and guidelines which are adopted by our Committee of Ministers. I would like to mention the European Court on Human Rights, which is very important and which has, for instance, unequivocally ruled that Holocaust denial is not protected by freedom of expression. So I think that this was a very important case law, which is being used not only by the Council of Europe, but in our member states. Our Committee of Ministers recently has adopted a recommendation on combating hate speech, which is very important, including the hate speech online. Some signals that we are receiving last days are of concern for us. And we are looking forward in 2025 to see how our fight against anti-Semitism online will continue with respect to the social networks. I think that you see what I'm meaning. We have our parliamentary assembly, and it is important that we have a permanent rapporteur on combating racism and intolerance and fighting anti-Semitism. We have few recent reports by the Parliamentary Assembly, which are important for us because they show the road for our member states. But let me maybe mention, first of all, I mean, as the most important institution for us in the Council of Europe, the ECRI, the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, which is our monitoring institution on fighting racism and intolerance, and of course, anti-Semitism. In all of each country reports after the country visits, the ECRI is raising the issue of anti-Semitism, in particular in the countries where it is relevant. I should say that unfortunately, in many of our member states, this is relevant nowadays. And in particular, after the 7th of October, after the terrorist attacks by Hamas in Israel, ECRI pays even more attention to the questions related to anti-Semitism, and we can see it in its country reports. But I would also like to mention the general policy recommendations by ECRI, and in particular today, the general policy recommendation number 9 on preventing and combating anti-Semitism, which has been recently revised and updated. And I think it constitutes a very important guideline for our member states. We also endorsed the guidelines by the United States recently, which is a global document, and they're very happy with the leadership of the United States. Now, I would like to mention one point about our strategic partner, who is the European Union. I think that the action plan by the European Union on combating anti-Semitism is remarkable. And it is remarkable with the second part of this action plan, which is on combating anti-Semitism and fostering the Jewish life. Because I think that this is of particular importance. You know, the life of Jewish population, of the Jewish communities today in Europe is not easy. And of course, for many, many decades, we were talking about commemoration of the Holocaust, remembrance, which is absolutely important. But I think this part on fostering Jewish life has been a game changer for many Jewish communities. And I would like to mention the work of our colleague, EU coordinator Katharina von Schnurbein in this respect, with absolutely key work and key contribution to this. And finally, let me say that, of course, the fight against anti-Semitism is in a way very successful because there are structures. There is this SECA, which is the committee uniting the special envoys on and representatives on fighting anti-Semitism, and many other communities which face discrimination. They look on this experience and take it as example. In my mandate, I have both fighting anti-Semitism and fighting anti-Muslim hatred, and I can tell you that when I'm working on this issue, many Muslim communities look what is being done in the area of fighting anti-Semitism as a very important example for building the fight against anti-Muslim hatred. And I think that in the next months, in the next years, we would have to coordinate this with our colleagues also fighting anti-Muslim hatred and share our experience. I would like once again to thank you, and I would like to wish all the best, in particular for Ambassador Lipstadt. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Güssel from the Council of Europe. We are truly global today, and I want to invite our last panelist, Mr. Fernando Lautenberg, to bring in the Latin American perspective. Latin America presents both unique and different challenges and opportunities in terms of combating anti-Semitism. How do you envision the Organization of American States deepening its efforts to promote inclusivity and address hate across the region? Over to Brazil.
Thank you very much to the Wilson Center, to you, Ambassador, my colleagues here. I would like especially to acknowledge Aaron Kayak, who with Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt has been fundamental to our efforts during these last 3 years, and it has been beyond everything a true pleasure to work with you and your office, and I hope we can keep meeting in other circumstances. And as we begin this new year, it's necessary to look back and reflect on the main events of 2024, positive or negative, in order to reflect on what we can change and what we should continue to do. 2024 surely was a year of extremes coinciding with the polarization experienced all over the world. Since the beginning of the conflict that arose after the Hamas terrorist attack in October 2023, we have watched a dangerous increase, a true tsunami in attacks against Jews around the world, and it wasn't different in the Americas. We saw it in terrorist acts, physical violence, manifestations of hate speech, especially on social media. In the second half of the year, we saw terrible episodes outside our continent, in Europe, in Oceania. In November, anti-Semitism manifested itself in violent and coordinated physical attacks against Israeli fans of Maccabi Tel Aviv who were visiting Amsterdam in the Netherlands to watch a football match. We could see then what globalized the Intifada looks like. And in December, as Gillian has mentioned to us, a fire started in a synagogue in Melbourne, practically destroying the building and causing concern in the local Jewish community, fortunately with no casualties. Throughout the year, we witnessed attacks against Jews in our region, especially in the United States, where we saw anti-Semitism showing at university campuses, supposedly defending Palestinian rights at places, prestigious places such as Columbia, Harvard, and Stanford. According to the Anti-Defamation League, the number of anti-Semitic actions in the United States has increased by 900%. And it was not different in Brazil or in Argentina, where especially social media acted as a conduit and a spreader, largely due to the lack of filters and controls. And this is a problem that, as we know, tends to get worse. And it's important to mention that it is not a cause and effect phenomenon. For instance, to say that the conflict in the Middle East increased anti-Semitism. No, in fact, it is anti-Semites take this opportunity to expose their prejudices publicly under the excuse of anti-Zionism, or, as we prefer to say, anti-Semitism related to the State of Israel. But despite so many negative occurrences, I believe we have also made some progress in many countries, promoted by political leaders and judicial branches. We should also consider 2024 as a year of progress in establishing more controls and punishments for anti-Semitic acts, at least before last week news, as we mentioned. Faced with the virtual proliferation of hate speech, companies that control some of the main social networks and digital platforms had decided to modify their content security policies. In November, Twitch announced an update to its conduct policy related to the term Zionists. The tool began to restrict the use of the expression to attack or belittle another individual or group of people based on their religion or religious belief. The Brazilian judiciary has also been making efforts to protect online environments. The liability of digital platforms for the dissemination of illegal content published by users is being nowadays judged by our federal Supreme Court. I defended the issue last November during an oral argument before the highest court in the land. Some justices have already voted, deciding that the Internet Civil Rights Framework is against the Brazilian Constitution, where it limits the liability of application providers only to cases of non-compliance with a court order to remove illegal content. I have been asked, Gillian, also as an expert witness in some cases here in Brazil, in order to explain to the judges and to prosecutors why and when you can identify a case as an anti-Semitic act. And I think this has proven a very effective way, and we got some convictions by people who were perpetrating anti-Semitic actions. I would also like to take this opportunity to highlight the recent conviction of a former Buenos Aires city councilman by the Argentinian courts for disseminating anti-Semitic speech. In this sense, it must be made clear, wherever it's necessary, that regulation is not an enemy of the right of freedom of expression. This is because it must necessarily be accompanied by a liability on what is published. On the other hand, we must remain alert and cautious regarding the new content moderation policies for posts on meta companies announced last week. I recall that many of us had cooperated so that the company would include the term Zionists when there was incitement to anti-Semitism in its content moderation rules at the beginning of the second semester of 2023. Let's see how it will stand now. Regarding the student demonstrations at the North American universities, which I mentioned earlier, we also had exemplary measures. In October, the Brown University Board rejected the proposal Brown Divest Now, aimed to cut investment in Israeli companies. In August, NYU released a new version of its student code of conduct to prevent discrimination. The University of São Paulo has also taken very important measures here by initiating disciplinary proceeding against 5 students who disseminated pro-Hamas and anti-Semitic documents during a gathering in 2023. We are also working with other Brazilian universities in the same directions. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank some important leaders with whom we had the pleasure of meeting and exchanging experience throughout the last year. The President of Paraguay, Santiago Peña, the Vice President of Costa Rica, Stefan Brunner, the participation that we had with Felix and other colleagues at the Human Rights Council, at the UN headquarters in Geneva, with Aaron, with Deborah Lipstadt and other special envoys. As well, recently, we participated in an event in Buenos Aires, promoted with the object of recognizing, on behalf of the OAS, the efforts of individuals and institutions of the Argentinian judicial branch in this fight against anti-Semitism. Finally, like to take this opportunity to congratulate the new presidents of the IRA in 2026, which will be headed by Argentina, the first country in Latin America to hold this position since the creation of the organization. I'm sure we can all agree that we have had a very challenging year, but I believe that it's increasingly clear that what the weapons are that we have to combat anti-Semitism around the world. More responsible control of digital platforms, investment in information and awareness, education, legislation, and law enforcement make up the list of instruments to be used in the new cycle. We hope that 2025 may be a year of peace and understanding, where hate finds no place to thrive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fernando Lautenberg. Thank you to all our panelists for sharing your expertise and vision for the future. I'd like to, we have about 5 minutes left, but I would like to take at least one question from the audience, maybe one question online to wrap up our discussion. I see a number of hands. Please, right there in the middle.
Thank you to all the speakers. I was wondering particularly...
For 1 second, because without the microphone, they won't hear you.
Online audiences won't hear you, so thank you. If you could introduce yourself as well.
Thank you, Stuart Grant. Thank you to all the speakers. I'm interested particularly on a focus in Australia because I understand in the last 12 to 18 months there have been thousands and thousands of immigrants coming into Australia from what would be called the Iranian Ring of Fire. And I'm wondering whether there has been any push as to immigration policy, whether looking into the potential immigrants' positions on anti-Semitism and whether they have been vocal proponents of those things has been taken into account in any of the countries who've been bringing in all of these immigrants.
Gillian Segal, do you want to take this?
Yep, sure. Well, it's a very good question, and it's a problematic issue. The Jewish community advocacy organizations have been very vocal about their concern because, you know, the assumption is that immigrants from Gaza, Palestinian territories, etc., will have a certain education and background, and therefore will find it very difficult to adopt Australian values of multiculturalism and peace. So there have been about 3,000 visas, I think, given to people from Gaza, and as well as a similar number from Israel, actually. A lot of those people have not actually arrived, but they've got one sort of a visa in their pocket. The government assures the community that they have been vetted, and there's very little that people can do about the policy other than, of course, change the government. The opposition has a very different view about immigration. But Australia has a very large refugee and intake, and they've come in under that intake. But as I say, there's been very little evidence of many of them arriving, and certainly no evidence of any breaches of the laws or anti-Semitic incidents involving current refugees. But it's a potential problem, but it's one that the government insists that they have vetted those individuals, which the community does not necessarily believe, because it's very hard to think about those people having any records or documentation, etc., that would display their you know, qualifications and their attitudes. So it's a problem.
Thank you, Gillian. One question that comes up in sort of different iterations has been mentioned by multiple speakers are the upcoming elections in different countries. Dr. Klein, if I could turn to you, and there is a question of how the topic of anti-Semitism or combating anti-Semitism could be used by different parties to their advantage. I sort of read between the lines here. The question is pertaining more to AfD, to Alternative for Germany. Could you share your thoughts in terms of the topic of anti-Semitism and elections coming up soon in Germany?
And could I just add a question to add to that? I'm particularly interested in the Green Party, because the Green Party in Australia has been the most virulently anti-Semitic. So just interested in the particular views.
Multiple parties.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm afraid that we will have a similar situation that in France last year, what Matthias Dreyfus said, that anti-Semitism could be an issue in the electoral campaign here too. We have Israel-related anti-Semitism in a variety of spectrums in our political arena, particularly in the left wing, of course, a political spectrum. For instance, a former not Green but Social Democrat Vice President of Parliament liked a terrible picture that had connections between Israel and terrorism, actually, and she was only a little bit criticized for it, and so we see that the left-wing political spectrum is is really in danger of following up on Israel-related anti-Semitism, and at the same time, we've just had a couple of party conventions last weekend, and the AfD, our right-wing populist, the right-wing populist party, actually suggested to abolish in our penal code the law against incitement of the people, and this is where Holocaust denial is regulated. And one of the most important leaders of this party is actually himself a subject of having committed this crime. And of course, if we abolish this article, then fighting anti-Semitism with the means of police and justice would even be more complicated. So we have the two different spectrum, and I'm afraid that we are facing really complicated times, and conspiracy theories or conspiracy myths, not theories, really are entering the political debate here in Germany. And of course, the Jewish community is at unease about this situation.
Rabbi Baker.
Yeah, just a comment on, we've already seen a really problematic evolution when it comes to elections in a number of European countries. It looks now like in Austria, we're poised to see a government that will be headed by the Freedom Party, a party that was effectively established by old Nazis. This was a party that joined as a junior partner in government decades ago, and at the time, the EU tried to ostracize the Austrian government. Today, it's simply accepting this as an inevitability. We saw in presidential elections in Romania the possibility, really the likelihood of a candidate espousing far-right, populist, anti-Semitic, Holocaust-denying rhetoric almost come to victory. The court basically declared that election invalid. There'll be another election this spring, but it remains to be seen there. We saw in Lithuania a new party emerge led by, again, someone who's openly anti-Semitic, openly denying the facts of the Holocaust in Lithuania. It received the third most number of votes. It didn't have to be, but in fact, it is now a coalition partner in the new government in Lithuania. So again, the sort of things that we were perhaps believing were no longer likely have not only become likely, they've become reality in a number of places.
Thank you, Rabbi Baker. Challenges remain. As we've seen today, combating anti-Semitism requires collective forward-thinking solutions and sustained commitments from governments, from organizations, from communities alike. We could have spent much more time discussing this topic, but again, I want to thank our panelists. This conversation, as Ambassador Green stated before, is just the beginning. Today's event will serve as a springboard for additional discussions throughout this year here at the Wilson Center on how we can work together on combating anti-Semitism. Thank you again for joining us, and then please join us at the future events here at the Wilson Center. Thank you.